Diana Elder, accredited genealogist professional, shares selecting DNA tools for a DNA research plan. She shares her own example of testing the hypothesis that Martin Shults is the father of Hickman Monroe Shults and shows how she selected DNA tools that would help her answer this objective. This is an excerpt from the Research Like a Pro with DNA online course. Each month we meet for office hours and share tips and answer questions of the course members. I hope you enjoy this video.
Talking about with DNA, selecting DNA tools and methodology. So we have to think both tracks, which is what makes our DNA research just a little bit more difficult than just doing regular research. So let's take a look. And I thought I would just show you some examples from my last DNA project that I did, because it wasn't like super complex, and sometimes we want to start or do something like that, and it could give you some ideas, especially if you're just beginning. So just as a reminder, this is what the research plan looks like. And of course, in the lesson, we go through all of these in depth, and I'm not going to do that today. I'm just going to give you a couple tips for each one and then show an example from my project. So we have the objective, and then we summarize the known facts. We do a working hypothesis, we identify some sources, and then we have a prioritized research strategy, which is what we use when we go to do our research. So some tips for the objective. Sometimes after you have done your timeline and you've done some preliminary work with the DNA and looking at matches, getting started, you have found that maybe your objective is either really, really broad and it's overwhelming you, or maybe it's just too narrow. And so this is a good time to go ahead and revise that objective. There is nothing wrong with that. Perhaps you've done your timeline and you see that there are 10 children, and at first you thought that you should verify all the children, and now you're realizing that's just way too difficult. And so you could just revise that and have it be maybe perhaps just verify one or two of the children. There's nothing wrong with, after you've gotten your feet wet in your project, to go ahead and revise. And by the same token, it could be a little bit too narrow. Maybe you're realizing there's just not enough DNA for whatever you're trying to prove, and you perhaps need to broaden that out and change your objective up a little bit. So this is just a good time to think about that when you're here in this phase. So here is my objective for the little mini case study we're going to do today. And this was my direct line. I was born a Schultz, the daughter of Bobby Jean. My grandpa was Charles Leslie, whose father was William Houston, whose father was William Henderson, whose father was Hickman Monroe, and whose father was Martin. Now, these gentlemen were all in Texas until my grandpa, who was born in Indian Territory, which became Oklahoma. And so in Texas, in these early years, as you know, if you have any Texas ancestors, there are not really anything like birth records anywhere. And in fact, there are a lot of places that just simply don't have good records because the courthouse burned. There were a lot of courthouse fires in Texas for some reason. And sometimes you just don't have the documents, which is why we turn to DNA. So this was a connection that was very firmly established by other researchers. They just said Hickman Monroe was the son of Martin, but I hadn't seen any records that said that. And I also didn't have any sources for his birth in 1821 in Bibb County, Alabama. I thought that was pretty specific. And so I decided to do a project on discovering and using DNA as well as documents to find out this connection. So this was the objective that I crafted. Using DNA analysis and documentary research, test the hypothesis that Martin S. Shults was the father of Hickman Monroe Shults. Martin was born about 1800 in Sevier County, Tennessee, and died in 1854 in Johnson County, Texas. He married Sarah T. Rowden on 24 December 1814 in Ray County, Tennessee. Hickman was born on 13 June 1821 in Alabama and died on 12 May 1899 in Falls County, Texas. He married Rachel Cox on 4 July 1848 in Navarro County, Texas. So you can see we have a lot of very specific dates here. So there was a marriage record for the couple. There was no birth record, but this appeared on his headstone at his grave. We know where he is buried, and we actually have a marriage record for his wife. So we had some specifics here, and other researchers had put in that this was Bibb County, Alabama. The censuses did show Alabama as his birthplace. So I put that this was a hypothesis because I hadn't proven this, and I wanted to use DNA analysis. Now, reading back over this, I realized I could have written that he was the biological father. And so for some reason, I didn't put that in there. If I was to go back and rewrite this, I would add that. So tips for the summary of known facts. So we've already done the timeline. I did an extensive timeline for both Martin and for Hickman. And so when you go to do your summary of known facts, do you need to put in every single thing that is in your timeline for this? Well, I would suggest that maybe you just use the most pertinent facts for the objective. Sometimes we include in our timeline perhaps all the children and their births and maybe their marriages. We can put in so many things about the family, but we have to think about what's most pertinent for the objective we have chosen. And so maybe we condense that a little bit, what we know, what the things we choose to put in our summary of known facts. Now, one of the things that I like to do for my own work as well as for client projects is when I'm doing this to create in a format that is nicely formatted, that often I can copy and paste and just put straight into the report. So I do like to take my time on the summary of known facts, put in the citations. Citations should already be done because they're on the timeline. But, there's different ways, and we show you in the lesson different ways of doing it, maybe a table, a narrative, a bulleted list. You can really think about what you would like to use for your report and perhaps put it in that format right from the beginning. Or, a lot of times I'll do the table and then I'll use that to write the narrative. I like writing a narrative. So just kind of consider that to save some time, maybe you want to have your summary of known facts be in a good format. So for this project, I did do that, and I put in a nice table for my summary of known facts. I did this in the project document, and I actually went ahead and wrote a narrative for this report. But often I will just take this and put it right into my actual report rather than writing the narrative. It just kind of depends on the project. So here you can see that I've got the date and event, locality, and the source. We always want to have our sources in this summary of known facts so we remember where we got the information. And you can see I have a lot of things after he gets married, and I have quite a few, censuses. I have some land records, but back here at the beginning for this birth, I didn't have much. I literally just had censuses. So nothing that really gave me any verification of his birth. Now, I also did a table for his father, for Martin. And in my Airtable, I had, a section for Martin, and I did the format so that you could just put in the person, either Martin or Hickman, and then I could group by that or have a separate view for just seeing my records just for Martin. And you can see I didn't have a whole lot of records for him either. Again, I had some censuses. He apparently dies by 1850 because his widow is only listed. So I've got their marriage and a tax record in Arkansas, and then a Mexican War record that's maybe for him, could be for a different Martin Shults, and a land patent for heirs of Martin Shults. So Hickman is not listed in this land patent. There are several other heirs. So as I was looking at it, I thought, well, why would he not be listed since he was living right there in Texas at the same time? And you'll notice that there are no records in Alabama, where supposedly he was born, where Hickman was born in the early 1820s. So this was kind of a sparse summary of known facts because I didn't know as much about Martin as I did about his son. So I'm going to have some fun places to go research. Now, the working hypothesis, this sometimes trips people up quite a bit because they'll think, I don't know anything. That's why I'm doing this project. I don't have a hypothesis. But really, we all have kind of a gut feeling about what happened. And we start with the most likely scenario. Our ancestors kind of were just boring. They just kind of did the usual thing. I mean, we all have the really unusual ancestors, but we want to start with just the usual. What do you think probably happened? And then write out a complete hypothesis. Sometimes I see these and they're just a couple sentences. It will serve you well if you really write it out. This is a good place to get all of your thoughts out of your brain and into your project document. So, for instance, this is what I wrote for the working hypothesis. And you can see that I'm basically taking the information from that summary of known facts and the objective and I'm just putting it into a narrative. So I said Martin Shults was born between 1790 and 1800, probably in Tennessee. He married Sarah Rowden, then moved to Alabama, Arkansas, and finally to Texas, where he died. His son, Hickman Monroe Shults, was born about 1821 in Alabama and also moved to Arkansas and Texas with the family. Verifying Martin's residence in Alabama by 1821, when Hickman was born, would add validity to the census record stating that birthplace. Authored sources on Ancestry Online Trees give Bibb or Perry County, Alabama as the residence of the Shults family. So you'll notice I don't have any source citations in this. They're all ready in that summary of known facts. So this is where I just get to write down my thoughts. And I don't know any of this for sure. I mean, some of it I know or have a pretty good idea, but some of it I don't know. And so I'm just estimating, I'm just guessing that Monroe was born in Alabama and moved with Arkansas and Texas with the family. That would be the usual thing. That's most likely that he was a child, a young man, and moved with the family. Could he have had something unusual happen? Perhaps he was adopted out or, something different. Of course, but I'm just sticking with the usual for this project because I don't have any clues to the contrary. Hickman lived in Navarro County, Texas by 1850, as did his probable mother, Sarah Shults, and brothers Martin and Wade. They are in the 1850 census. A land record of 1857 names the heirs of Martin Shults as Sarah T. Shults, Martin V. Shults, and Paulina K. Hoggard. These are most likely some of his children. Hickman was not named, perhaps because he'd already received his own land patent. Okay, so I'm giving some reasoning about what was going on with the family. Hickman is living next door to Sarah Shults and these brothers, Martin and Wade. So, that's pretty good evidence that there's a family connection. So I've got that at least. Ancestry DNA through lines show many DNA matches for descendants of Hickman Monroe Shults and his probable siblings. Verifying the trees, the documentary research, and the amount of shared DNA will provide evidence of this relationship. So I'm giving some methodology here. I'm going to look at trees. I have a lot of through lines because this is a Southern family. Everybody had a lot of kids. There's a lot of descendants. So through lines can give me some good places to start. But I'm also going to use documentary research and I'm going to use the amount of shared DNA. So this is what I wrote up for my working hypothesis. The next step is to get that list of identified sources going. And this is where you're going to be so grateful if you have done a really good locality guide, because now you can just copy and paste from the locality guide what you think will be really good for this project. Now, in this project, I had some different localities. So one of my tricks is to organize by locality in my identified sources, and I'll show you that. And then we also want to consider the DNA tools that would be most relevant. So we spent the last 2 office hours talking about tools for clustering and tools for segment data. And in the lesson, we go through a lot of tools. Do you need to list all the tools that you could possibly use for your project? Well, no, you don't, because you're certainly not going to have time to use all of them. So after you've learned about the tools, then you'll just consider a few that would be most relevant. And you'll probably want to start with the more simple tools. And then if this is the second or third phase, maybe do something that's a little bit more complex. So in this case, Here's my list of identified sources. And I had Bibb County, Alabama, and then I also had Perry County, Alabama. These were both places where online trees said that Hickman was born. And so, because there really wasn't a consensus, I decided I would research both, and they are neighboring counties, so it makes sense, that perhaps records could be in both. So I like to organize like that just so that I can focus on one county, then focus on another. And then for my DNA tools, this was really simple because I already knew I was going to use through lines. But then I also thought I could also do a Gephi network graph. I already have one for this family. I could really look at some of the clusters. And then, of course, in through lines, you've got a lot of incomplete trees. I'd probably be verifying, building some trees for good matches. So I kept this pretty simple. Now, when we prioritize, start simple and add more if needed. So we teach you to only do about 5 sources and to not go crazy with prioritizing a big list of maybe 20 because you might be changing midstream where you're going with this project. So don't waste a lot of time here and keep it pretty small. You can always go back to your big list if you use up all of these and you need more sources to search. And then, of course, consider your record availability and ease of use. And as I said before, don't select too many DNA tools. Now, I could have done more of my identified sources for DNA, but I already kind of knew what I was going to do, which is why I only put in a few. So here's what my prioritized research plan looked like. And so I had my Bibb County. I don't show my Perry County here, but I've got my plan all prioritized. And I had these check marks so that when I actually did the research, I clicked it and then it X'd it out. So, that lets me see where I am at in the research, what I've done. Something else I do here is when I do the research, sometimes I'll type in here done with just like a little summary of what I found, just so I remember where I'm at. I, of course, will put all my searches in Airtable in the research log. And then for my DNA tools for the prioritized plan, I wrote it out just a little bit more so that I kind of remembered what I was doing. Ancestry DNA through lines for Martin Shults. For the main test taker, Lucretia, is what I'm going to be using. She's my person. I always use her DNA. She's a generation closer than me. Identify the matches with the largest segments and enter them into Airtable. So this is my methodology for using through lines. I like to use the list view in through lines instead of the relationship view because then I can quickly see the largest, the people who are sharing the largest amount, and using those helps me get the best matches. And then I also have a few other test takers, so I wanted to do a matrix and just see how much they share, verifying a good genetic network for Martin Shults. And then verify the online trees. And I put Gephi last here because I thought with the number of matches, I probably will be able to just using through lines have enough. But if I want to go for it, find some more, I could always do Gephi. So I put this last because these two are easier to do. They're just right there for me to work on. Okay, so what did I find? Well, I'll tell you. So this project successfully confirmed Martin Shults as the father of Hickman Monroe Shults through documentary evidence and evaluating DNA matches. The research found Martin Shults residing in Bibb County, Alabama in the early 1820s when Hickman was born. So I'll stop here for a second and tell you what I found. It was a series of court records, and these court records were actually abstracted into a book that was at the Family History Library, listing all of these various Shults men in many different activities, and they were in their court records. So it was fabulous evidence that they were living right there in Bibb County. The 1830 and 1840 census enumeration for Martin Shults revealed his migration from Alabama to New Madrid County, Missouri. This was a new census that I did not have. I did not have this location of New Madrid County. So that was exciting to find that. It was not indexed correctly, or it was really faint. It was one of those that was more difficult to read. And so that was fun to find that. and then to Pulaski County, Arkansas. Those censuses contain placeholders for a male born about 1821 that would be Hickman. Additionally, Hickman and heirs of Martin Shults received Texas land patents under the Mercer colony, likely migrating at or near the same time between 1840 and 1847. So I fleshed out the land records a bit, never did find anything that actually said Hickman as the son of Martin, but got him in the right place, found a place for him in the family. So DNA matches to Hickman's third great-granddaughter through each of his proposed siblings provide evidence of a genetic connection to Martin Shults and Sarah Rowden. Identifying and verifying additional DNA matches can strengthen the genetic evidence. So I feel like this is pretty well proven, but I would want to do some more. There were several children, and I would want to do more research on each of the children, each of the siblings, and then find even more matches, just to have positive proof and to know a little bit more about this family. So this was a really good start on this project, but I don't feel like it's done. I feel like there's more I can do. So hopefully that gave you some ideas about research planning, just kind of seeing an example of how I did a fairly simple research plan. You know, this wasn't crazy with the DNA. This was just kind of using some those through lines and using what was out there.